Hello, I'm Michael Liebreich, and this is Cleaning Up. As we've heard from many of our guests over the past few years, the world has been making great progress on CO2 emissions. They're no longer growing out of control. We are at or near peak annual emissions. Sadly, CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas. In episode 146, Bryony talked to Jason Anderson about super polluters, among them nitrous oxides and exotics like sulfur hexafluoride. Today, it's time to do a deep dive into methane, fossil gas, or, as the fossil fuel industry has persuaded us to call it, natural gas. It's such a contested area that I'm going to change the format a little bit for this episode. I'm going to start with a bit of a primer. Now, if you already know all about methane leakage, why it's a problem, and why the rates of leakage are so controversial, you're allowed to fast forward to the point about 15 minutes in where I'm joined by this week's guest. Otherwise, here's a bit of background. 40% of methane emissions globally are from natural sources, mainly from wetlands. The other 60%, however, is anthropogenic, and that means it's our fault. In 2023, the International Energy Agency estimated that around 350 million tons of methane were released to the atmosphere as a result of human activity. And methane is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. Over a 100-year period, each ton of methane has a global warming potential 30 times as powerful as CO2. So that methane that is being released as a result of our activities is equivalent to a release of 10.5 billion tons or gigatons of CO2. You have to compare that to an emission of 37 gigatons of actual CO2. So all in all, methane is responsible for around 30% of all historic global warming since the Industrial Revolution. However, methane degrades relatively quickly in the atmosphere, so all of its impact is front-loaded. Over a 20-year period, methane has a global warming potential that is 80 to 85 times as much as CO2, which means that over a 20-year period, that 350 million tons of methane is equivalent to no less than 28 gigatons of CO2. So 37 gigatons of actual CO2 and then 28 gigatons equivalent over a 20-year period of methane. So if you're worrying about the climate in 2044, in 20 years' time, as I think you should be, today's methane emissions are almost as big a problem as CO2. So where do those anthropogenic methane emissions actually come from? Well, the biggest source, 36%, is from agriculture, largely from cattle. And if you've ever wondered which end of a cow it comes from, the answer is both. There is more methane in cow burps than in cow farts, but methane is also given off by manure. The other big agricultural sources include decomposing vegetation in flooded rice paddies and in artificial irrigation reservoirs. But the next biggest contributor, and what we'll be focusing on during this episode, is fossil fuels at 30%. That comes from leakage during the production, transport, and use of oil, gas, and coal. The final big source is waste going to landfill. That's about 18%, emitting methane as it decomposes. Now, there have been international efforts to agree to lower methane emissions, especially from fossil fuels. This has been going on for some years. All the way back in 2004, US President George W. Bush introduced the Methane to Markets Partnership to try to get international consensus on reducing methane emissions, partly instead of really dealing with CO2 emissions. This was then relaunched in 2010 by President Obama as the Global Methane Initiative. And since then, emissions have continued to increase. but so has the awareness of its contribution to climate change. In 2021, at COP26, methane really came under the spotlight. President Joe Biden and the European Union President Ursula von der Leyen signed the Global Methane Pledge, with the aim of cutting methane emissions by 30% from 2020 levels by 2030, a target which I immediately condemned as insufficiently ambitious. Coming into COP28 in 2023, China finally joined the methane brigade, not signing the methane pledge, but announcing a bilateral agreement with the US to enhance cooperation on climate goals and, crucially, unveiling a plan domestically to reduce methane emissions, particularly from coal mines. 155 countries have now signed up to that global methane pledge, but India, Russia, Iran, Algeria, and Venezuela are among the countries that have not. And you'll note they are all oil and gas producers, and they're responsible for 30% of the global emissions of methane from the oil and gas industry. Last year, in the US, the Environmental Protection Agency announced that the federal government would, for the first time, require oil and gas producers to actively detect and fix leaks of methane. And in April this year, the EU adopted a new law to cut methane emissions across the bloc. Now, in both cases, it's a little unclear exactly how this will play out in practice and how any of this is going to be enforced. But piece by piece, the methane abatement puzzle is slowly being filled in. We are still on an upward trend, but one could be optimistic and think that's about to reverse. But there's a big problem: data. Part of the problem of stopping methane leaks is detection. Methane is a colorless, odorless gas. So, with the naked eye, it's pretty much impossible to spot. And if you're a big gas producer or distributor with a network of pipes running across a state or country, leaks can go unnoticed for weeks, months, years. For better or for worse, it's not like an oil spill where entire coastlines are swamped with black goop almost immediately. Terrible for the environment, but easy to detect. For methane, you need satellites, drones, people out in the field equipped with infrared cameras to detect leaks. Satellites, great for picking up leaks on a macro scale, but they're not yet high enough resolution to pinpoint the exact leak to a specific well or collection unit within a collection area. People and drones are required to home in on the precise spot in order to enforce action. Now, this is its own burgeoning field in the climate space. In fact, my co-host, Bryony, had two fantastic conversations in episode 157 of Cleaning Up, one with Dr. Sebastian Beerode, one with Sharon Wilson, an academic and an activist respectively, both of them on the hunt for leaking methane and ways of stopping it. At an international level too, there's been progress with MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, becoming an increasingly hot topic in climate negotiations. Ahead of COP26 and the launch of the Global Methane Pledge, the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, launched the International Methane Emissions Observatory to monitor the commitments and actions of countries that were signing up to the pledge. And in March this year, the launch of MethaneSat, you guessed it, a sat or satellite dedicated to sniffing out methane and its sources. That was launched into space by the Environmental Defence Fund and the New Zealand Space Agency. But getting reliable methane data is hard. There's lots of uncertainty, in particular around the production of natural gas. And that is the methane that is piped into homes, piped into power plants around the world for heating, cooking, and producing electricity. Over the last few years, natural gas has been given a second lease of life as a transition fuel. It's the relatively good cop in the bad cop world of coal. It's still a fossil fuel, but supposedly far less polluting. You only need to look at the UK's emissions profile over the last few decades to see the positive impact of switching from coal to gas. But, as always, it's not entirely simple. Because depending on how much of that natural gas, that methane, is leaked throughout production, transportation, distribution, and use, natural gas can turn from good cop to villain. The science, the global warming potentials of methane and CO2 say that for natural gas to have a lower climate footprint than other fossil fuels, particularly coal, there can be leakage of no more than 3.2% from end to end. But a 2022 study by Robert Howarth at Cornell University estimates that in the US, that figure is 4.8%. And because methane is so much more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2, remember, 85 times more potent in the first 20 years, Howarth concluded that this level of leakage means methane has overall a greater greenhouse gas footprint than any other fossil fuel when it's burned. Not just coal, but also oil. But that's just one number from one researcher. By comparison, the US Environment Protection Agency gives a much lower figure than Rob Howarth, saying that leakage is just 0.93% in 2019 across upstream, midstream, and downstream. The International Energy Agency is a little more conservative, estimating the figure at 1.4%. But if Howarth's figure of 4.8% is correct, then natural gas is not just a villain, but a supervillain. If the EPA is correct, or even the IEA, then methane, natural gas, remains the good cop. So we should allow it to stay on the force throughout its greying years before being retired for something even cleaner. And it gets more complicated because methane is not the only gas being released by oil and gas facilities. There are other gases given off, particularly by oil, once it's brought to the surface and released from that massive pressure that it exists under the surface. So there are ethanes, propane, butanes, pentanes. So it's easy to talk only about methane, but these are different gases being released by different types of wells, different pieces of equipment, different characteristics, and different global warming potentials. And all of this really, really matters for the climate, especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The US has become the world's biggest producer and exporter of natural gas. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been invested globally on the premise that natural gas is a cleaner stopgap between our fossil present and our low-carbon future. So who's right? And how can we find ways to reduce those methane emissions in either case? To help me sort through this, I'm joined by Grant Swartzwelder, an old friend of mine from Harvard Business School. He's founder of OTA Environmental Solutions and ESG Dynamics, based in Dallas, Texas. And he's a frontline expert on all of the above. Please welcome Grant Swartzwelder to Cleaning Up. Before we get started, if you're enjoying Cleaning Up, please make sure that you like episodes, subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, and leave a review. That really helps other people to find us. Please recommend Cleaning Up to your friends and colleagues, and sign up for our free newsletter at cleaninguppod.substack.com. That's cleaninguppod.substack.com. Cleaning Up is brought to you by the Liebreich Foundation, the Gilardini Foundation, and Ecopragma Capital. So, Grant, welcome to Cleaning Up.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
So let's start where we always do. We're going to ask you sort of who you are and what you do in your own words. But this one's got a bit of a twist because you've got to cover 34 years. So the audience needs to know we were at business school together. We were sitting in a Harvard Business School classroom in Kresge 34 years ago. So what have you been doing since then?
I could say recovering from sitting in that Harvard Business School class. No, really, I've always enjoyed visiting with you at class, and it's been great to kind of reconnect over the years. What I've been doing, and I guess why I'm here today, is we kind of do everything emissions related with a company called OTA Environmental Solutions and with a company called ESG Dynamics. So we take care of looking at emissions and vent issues in the upstream oil and gas and provide solutions for that, be that equipment like flares, combustors, vapor recovery units, whether it's field service where we go and fix equipment to make sure they're running effectively, or consulting for filling out all the regulatory forms like Tier 2, greenhouse gas, Phase 1s, all the acronyms that you could appreciate. And then ESG Dynamics takes it a different level where we look at all the data that exists in the public domain regarding environmental issues. That's EPA data, Environmental Protection Agency, various state agency data, and then put it all together so that it's very easy to see who the good performers are and who the bad performers are.
So, in the little intro prior to bringing you into the conversation, which I think you listened to, we talked about the overall problem of methane and other volatile components that are being released by the oil and gas sector. And we kind of, we talked about, which sort of said, okay, yeah, it happens in agriculture and so on. But, we're homing in here. And you really are you're at the heart of it. You're there in Texas. Yes. And, the U.S. is the biggest, because it's got the biggest oil and gas, footprint. It's got the biggest methane and other emissions leakage footprint. And you're there, and that is your business. You have these two businesses, one actually trying to sort of help people capture the vapor recovery and so on and consult with them on how to do it. And the other one is tracking the data. So it should be a fantastic conversation, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, we primarily focus in Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, which happens to be obviously a huge producer of oil and gas. We touch 1,800 pieces of equipment every 30 days. So it's always interesting. We see at the field level how things are really going, and then we hear producers say what they say about their environmental efforts.
And the people, your clients, would be presumably big, medium-sized, and small oil and gas companies. I mean, so
we do a wide range from the smallest to the majors that you would recognize.
So how can I put this nicely? If we reach the end of the episode and it's clear that actually the U.S. oil and gas sector in Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico are doing a fantastic job, then it'll be down to you. But if it's not, it'll also be down to you. Is that fair?
Well, or it could be that our clients are doing fantastic because of us, and it's all those others that need to actually use us. How about that for a shill commercial?
Exactly. Well, why don't we come back and see if see if we give a great big plug to OTA and to ESG Dynamics at the end. But can we start with the engineering, which it's really important. So why is there a problem? I mean, how hard is it? What is actually happening? Why is this stuff ending up in the air in the first place? It's valuable, right? So why is it being lost in the first place? Can you talk us through why there are any, where do these emissions come from? There's different sort of reasons for them in oil, in gas. Give us the kind of overview.
Yeah, when you suggested leading off with that, I thought that was so important because there's so many people I deal with on the regulatory side, the environmental advocacy side, public relations side that don't really understand where a leak comes from. And if you don't really know where the root cause is coming from, the leak, how do you really fix it? And so when you can get very complicated very fast, but we'll try to keep it fairly high level, that you have oil wells and gas wells. Gas wells generate gas, obviously, and because of that, their facilities, their capturing system is such that it's capturing the product that it wants, the gas. where the issue comes in, and when you talk about flaring and emissions, that tends to be with oil wells, because with the oil that's being produced, there's something called associated gas. There's gas captured in that oil, and once it goes up into a tank or flows throughout, then gas starts being emitted from there, coming out of solution, and that creates most of the problems that when you talk about methane and emissions. It's the oil well that is really the suspect, which is kind of strange when you think about it.
Okay, so if you've got a gas, if you've got a gas well, it's producing gas. What you're saying is you've got a system to capture that. That's the valuable product. You're probably connected to a pipeline.
Yep.
So
your whole facility is based on that. Now, can you still have leaks? You bet, but that is the small percentage compared to the oil well.
Okay, but we'll slice and dice, and we'll see if we agree that it's a small percentage, as we go through this, because there's some bits and pieces of data we need to cover. But broadly speaking, you're saying that the gas goes into the gas pipes, and the problems tend to come from associated gas. But it's not just methane. I mean, there's a whole bunch of gases that are being off-gassed and coming out, because the methane is not. I mean, I don't know if it's in solution or if it's just alongside the oil, but there are also some gases that are literally dissolved in the oil. And when you bring them out, the pressure drops and they start to be emitted. They start to evaporate out from the oil.
And
right?
Methane is just part of the natural gas that's in solution. So you're exactly right. You have the oil, then you have natural gas bubbling out, and methane is one of the main components of that natural gas that flows.
But there are others. There's ethane and propane and all sorts of things.
There's hydrogen sulfide.
Right?
There's a lot of things that are really bad for people and the environment.
And those come out at pretty high pressure, right? I mean, some of them, not all of them, they come out at, they can't be contained in a tank. If you just have a tank of oil, which is essentially at almost atmospheric pressure, these gases are coming out and the pressure is building and building and building in that tank.
It can only build to a certain point because they're only structured for a certain pressure. And so that gas either has to go down a pipeline and be captured and either destroyed through a combustor or a flare, or you use a vapor recovery unit and you push that gas into a pipeline someplace where it can be taken somewhere and processed. Now, on the other side, if you don't have those control devices in place to save the tank and not let it explode, then the thief hatch, the little opening on the top of the tank, has to open, and that's when your emissions can really hurt you because it'll flow out. You don't want it to build up too much pressure because that'll create issues for the tank, as in destroy it.
Okay, so because what we're doing here is kind of slicing and dicing and saying, look, all leaks, all emissions are not, they may look the same when you see some, single figure in some IPCC report or some EPA report, but actually why they're happening, there's a whole range of reasons. So we've got methane, you've got gas wells where as you said, can you have leaks? Sure, right? So that's one type. Then you've got oil where this pressure builds up and builds up. And if you don't deal with it correctly, or if you've not got the investment in place, then you're going to have to vent it or flare it or do something. Right. And then, that's a different sort of problem. But what about, you've also got that's in normal operation. Mm-hmm. But what about in, startup and shutdown and bad weather? And there's all these kind of emergency situations. Something breaks. I mean, is that those are presumably other reasons where there's just some catastrophic failure of a piece of equipment? And is that how big is that of a problem compared to those first two that we've talked about?
Yeah, when you're drilling a well and you flow it back initially to get the fluid started and get it into the facility, and you can emit a decent amount of gas at that point. Now, there are rules that have been put in place causing it to be more of a closed loop system, meaning you try to keep all that gas in control in the facility. The other thing that you alluded to is kind of emergency use. And that's where you have a flaring out on location. And for some reason, you have to shut the location in. The pipeline is shut in and you have to do something with that gas. That tends to be a big slug of gas because it's happened all of a sudden and it's not necessarily it could be an emergency, or it could be just something having to do with the downstream system that causes it all to back up, and there's no place for it to go except through a control device. Where that normally goes is through a flare, which is a long piece of metal going up 20, 40, 100 feet high, depending on the amount of gas it's supposed to handle, and then it's burned up there. Those flares are, with some of the changes that have just been made, are supposed to be upwards to 98, 99% efficient. Big question whether they all are, meaning they probably aren't. But that should eliminate the methane going up, and if it's sit upright, you're burning it very efficiently. That's the goal.
Interesting. So there's a friend of mine who runs, Mark Davis, who runs something called Flare Intel. And, I've talked to him about whether those flares are efficient. What percent slip is there within the flare? Mm-hmm. So you're flaring and you think that you're turning all of that, all those hydrocarbons into CO2, but actually there's a bunch that just doesn't burn off and ends up. And these are very bad, as we heard in the intro that I recorded. Those are very bad greenhouse gases if they just get through that system, or if the flare is not lit, if it's just vented rather than flared.
It kind of comes down to two main things. The flare has to be sized appropriately so that it can handle the amount of gas that you have, and that works on the low end and the high end. If you have something too big, then it can't burn the small gas effectively. If you have a flare that's too small, then if you push a lot of gas through it, then it won't burn it efficiently. And then the second point is that you've got to do preventative maintenance on that to make sure that it lights, that it can handle everything it's supposed to do. And unfortunately, not everyone is doing a steady preventative maintenance plan to make sure that it does work. So there's those aspects of how a flare can be better than others.
Okay, so you've got the kind of you've got some perhaps quite small levels of leakage or of excess pressure builds up and whatever, and then you've got these kind of catastrophic or the bigger chunks, and they have to be dealt with different equipment, different approaches. We talk one is vapor recovery, the other is flaring, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you said you can have a decent amount of gas given off. I mean, I think probably my listeners are probably, half of them will be like, oh, that sounds like a decent amount of gas. The other half are going to be like, no, that sounds like an indecent amount of gas. But are there within obviously your clients are all doing a fantastic job at this, but are there also some bad apples? Is everybody equally magnificently good down in Texas and in Oklahoma and New Mexico?
Well, with any industry, there are definitely good actors and bad actors, and it all depends on the culture that company has and willing to spend the money and the time to make their equipment be sized correctly, be able to operate correctly, and be in good functioning capabilities. So there's definitely issues out there. To that end, in the Quad OB, which is a form of regulation that was just issued a few months ago, there's a thing called a super emitter, which is where they've kind of deputized a lot of people to identify potential leaks that are over 100 kilograms. Very hard to figure out what 100 kilograms is for me or for anyone, but the idea
is that 100 kilograms per second, per day, per minute in total?
Per day. But usually that means it's enough that by satellite, by airplane, by OGI type camera, you can tell when it's emitting that much. And then there's a mechanism that they get to announce how it's going to happen, but to basically inform the EPA and then the state to be able to tell on those folks and try to get something resolved.
Just a question though, in your experience working, small, medium, large, and so on, can you say is it correct that like the bigger companies are more competent, they're doing this more rigorously, and the smaller ones not? Or how do you what's the heuristic here when you sort of start talking to a client and you think, wow, these people are really just not across this? Do you ever get that feeling? And if so, what are the tells? What are the things that make you think, okay, we got a lot of work to do here, getting this company up to spec?
Well, again, we're out in the field touching a lot of different producers' wells, so we see the small and the the big, and quite frankly, it's the the environmental issues are not limited just to small players or just to large players. All of them have, most of the larger players are the ones drilling big new wells. And because of that, they have the capital to really do all the equipment, all the facilities first rate, and eliminate a lot of the issues we're talking about. But the large companies also have a lot of wells that are marginal at best. And those are the ones that create leaks or venting. And it's hard to justify on a well basis spending the money for that. The smaller operator has the same thing where they're, at the end of the day, they're there to make money. And to justify spending a lot of money on a marginal producer is very hard just from a pure economic sense, with the various regulations and the fines and kind of the various public relations issues or mechanisms out there. You're seeing a lot more companies take this more seriously and really fix their locations to handle that type of venting.
Yeah, the reason I ask is that I was talking to somebody from Chevron, and they were saying, look, the issue here is we're actually, we're way above the average. There's these kind of methodologies that are being used to say, well, you're probably emitting this, you're probably emitting that, and here's the calculation using methodologies that are based on averages. And they said, well, this is kind of unfair because we are not average. We know we're better than average. Is that credible?
Well, that's a little problematic in the thought process, because what happens there is that the chevrons, to use your example, or I should just say the generic large independent major, they have wells that are so large and produce so much that when you start looking at the vapor and emissions as a numerator and volume as a denominator, their volume is the denominator so big, it makes their percentages look fantastic. Now, they still have a lot of individual wells that have problems that need investment. Now, the smaller companies don't have these big producers, so they don't have the big denominator. And so their ratios definitely look worse. But there's one company out in West Texas that we do some work for, but I'm not going to say the name, that they have more wells that need to be plugged than any other company out in West Texas. And they're very large, in the news all the time. Well, they've got an environmental issue, not necessarily emissions. They have a plugging issue, but there's also emissions related to that.
Right. And because there's also, as we sort of, just to complete on this question, sort of for, why does this stuff happen? And you've alluded to it when you talk about plugging and when you talk about some of these, older wells. How many wells and how many holes in the ground are there in the 3 states where you operate? I mean, it's hundreds of thousands, or is it millions?
Oh, it's probably in the low million level. Here's an example. The Texas Railroad Commission, as a state, plugged roughly 5,000 wells last year, but the number of wells that they need to plug increased more than that. So they plugged 5,000, spent all the money associated with that, which I don't know the amount, but it's like running in place because you still have the same number, if not more, wells that need to be plugged. And what's going to happen with all these regulations that we have that we will probably be talking about is, as those regulations really push hard on these marginal wells, you run a real chance of those marginal producers just saying, I give up. And what happens to those wells? Well, they become kind of the joy of the state regulator or the state to do something with. And so the unintended consequence of a lot of the air emissions rules could be you end up with a lot of wells that need to be plugged.
Yeah, I mean, I can do some math on that. If you tell me let's just do it with 1 million. If a well has a 20-year life, then that means there's 50,000 wells per year coming to the end of their life. And what you're saying is 5,000 of them got plugged, maybe another 5,000 by their original owner who's still around. But that's an awful lot of wells that are just kind of orphaned.
Yeah, and just to clarify that's 5,000 by the state with their funds. You
Right.
have other companies like your Chevron and others that have a robust plugging. But and a lot of the larger companies are pretty good at plugging the wells because they just set a certain amount of capital aside to handle that. But there's a lot of smaller companies that they don't have the capital to go spend $20,000 to $100,000 to plug a well, and so it just sits there until they either go out of business or something bad happens.
I can do some other maths. If you're telling me it costs 100,000 to plug a well, and you've got a million, just to use the number a million, that's $100 billion that's going to have to be spent at some point over the next 20, 30 years to plug all of that.
Yeah, and I gave you a range. It's probably, there are some, like there was a well in the just off the coast in Texas that they plugged. It cost $2 million to plug. So there are definitely examples where it's more expensive, but there are a lot of shallow top wells, and those are going to be in the $20,000 to $40,000 range. Right. So, but even do your math at 20 or 30,000 times the volume, that's still a big number.
Right. And I think it's really, it's useful to get some kind of just heuristics of, if we really want to fix this problem, is $1 billion going to do it? Is 10 billion going to do it? Or is it going to be 30, 40, 50 billion, 100? Or is it we have nuclear cleanup in the UK. We have one nuclear site, Windscale, which is like 200 billion pounds that it's going to cost. Oh, and it's going to take 100 years. So, these things happen. And it's really important, I think, just to kind of get a sense. Let's just take a short time out because you've used some acronyms. We don't really allow acronyms on cleaning up, or we allow them only when they're well explained. So let's back up a little because the audience here, you've got to assume they're all really smart, but they're not experts. They come from all sorts of different backgrounds: policy, finance, civic society, etc. And who's regulating this, right? I think EPA is the U.S. federal Environmental Protection Agency. Yes. Right. But then you've got some other players down in, let's take Texas as the example, because that's probably going to be the most significant one. Who's regulating down at the state level?
Yeah, you have the federal level, as you mentioned, and then at the state level in Texas, you have two groups, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which tends to focus more on air related issues, so emissions and venting and things like that. Then down here, you also have the very misnamed Railroad Commission, which has nothing to do with railroads, but it all has to do with managing oil wells at the surface level and below. So if you're disposing of water, if you're putting a facility in place, if you're getting a permit, you go through the Railroad Commission. So in theory, they work together. But what's odd about all that is that they both have different identification numbers for a well than each other. And so they can't communicate between each other. So that makes it harder for them to be effective. Each state has at least one, if not both, of those type of agencies. Then you also have a variety of groups like the Bureau of Land Management or University of Lands, which are groups that control large parts of land and will also do some additional regulatory work, which makes it challenging for the operator because now you have a federal, you have a state, and then you have a kind of a property owner type of a management group. And so you can have up to 3 different distinct regulatory set of rules that you have to manage through. So it becomes very complicated for the operator.
And I know from previous conversations, that's one of the things that ESG Dynamics does is just make sure that everything actually, you're saying the same thing to different people and not creating a regulatory risk by just, not keeping it all internally consistent.
Well, because if you're really going to take care of the issue, you need to understand what the issue is. And I think we're going to be talking about data and, this person says X and this person says Y. And as an engineer, it's like, well, you have data that the states, the federal EPA, that they have. If you can put all that together, you have a much better chance of being able to see who the good performers are, who the bad ones are, and why.
Okay, and exactly. Let's move on to that because so you got all of these operators and millions of individual locations. And by the way, that means tens of millions of pieces of equipment that, frankly, you ought to be tracking and monitoring with this valve and that valve and vapor recovery unit and pressure release system and flares that need preventive maintenance. I mean, yes. It's a task of vast data complexity. But these organizations, these companies, your clients, are they self-monitoring? Are they self-reporting? Who's actually measuring what?
No, it's the individual company that reports to the state agencies and the federal agencies. Now, both of those groups do have audit capabilities and enforcement capabilities. I'd argue that they're not the most stringent in their enforcement, but you start seeing some states like the state of New Mexico and actually in Texas, I've seen the TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, starting to be much more proactive in interviewing and investigating. It's those type things that will definitely get people's attention.
So what are the biggest fines that have been levied because of infringements around this, releases of whether it's methane or some of the other off gases?
Yeah, you'll see some federal, like in Colorado years ago, there was a close to $30 million fine. More recently, you see in New Mexico a variety of fines, usually in the $4 to $10 million range, which is significant. And it usually starts off with someone seeing a flare that isn't burning efficiently. And that kind of triggers the investigation. And then it goes into all the administrative data.
So this is a big, nasty, old smoky thing that's creating a big cloud of whatever. And you think, hang on a second, what's going on there?
And it doesn't even have to be as dire as what you've described. If it's burning efficiently, you don't see black smoke. You see black smoke, then it's not burning as efficiently.
Right.
And that's when, you either need to improve the equipment or make modifications. So, but they'll see that initially. And that's what the super emitter item will start. It'll start identifying those issues. And then once that happens, the New Mexico regulatory folks have really dug in and do long investigations. They have several companies under consent decrees so that they can really manage and make sure that that money is, that the fines are paid and that the improvements that the company has been required to make are actually making them.
Okay, but now you say that the fines, it's not, there are now, in a sense, you're saying that there's an increasing number of sort of fines, $2, $3, $4 million fines for this sort of stuff. How much does if you've got an oil well or a system of wells collection, and then it's going off into an oil pipeline, but you can't deal with the gases, how much would a vapor recovery system, a really good one that really works, that's going to be good for the next 20, 30 years, what's the capital cost of something like that?
Yeah, and it depends how large it needs to be, which is dependent on how much gas you're producing. But you're talking somewhere in the $50,000 to $100,000 range for a vapor recovery unit. And then most likely you would also put a flare out there so that if the vapor recovery unit goes down for some reason, like some of the issues we talked about previously, then it has a place to go. And so that flare would probably be a larger location, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000. So you're talking altogether $150,000, and that's a very large facility that would need something that big.
Okay, so that's a couple of 100,000 of capex, and then you've probably got a few tens of thousands a year of maintenance and so on. Maybe just using OTA to do a little few bits and pieces of services.
And again, what's happening with that, especially if you use a flare, that you're burning it and you don't get anything for it. A vapor recovery unit, though, you're keeping that gas in the system. That gas, because it's coming out of oil, is a very high, you'll love this acronym, BTU, burning capabilities. And because that is the higher burning means higher value. And that value, instead of $3 an MCF for gas, it could be $7, $8 an MCF. So if you have a vapor recovery unit and you keep that gas in, you could end up paying for that equipment just from the gas that you're capturing. So there's economic values.
You didn't want to say it, but a BTU is a British thermal unit, right?
Well, I figured I'd let you have the joy of...
you may think that down in Texas you know all about this stuff, but you're still using our units.
We are. It's...
Now, okay, so what you're saying is, you need to spend a few £100,000, you spend a few tens of thousands of maintenance, but you're getting something in that case, you're getting something valuable in return. Does it pay for itself? I mean, because I guess where I'm going with this is it gets back to why is this problem happening? Because, if it's not that expensive to stop it happening, if you make money when you collect this stuff, and if you get a fine if you do it badly, why the hell are we even having this conversation? Why is it not just a kind of done deal and sorted?
And that's where you have to really compartmentalize the type of wells that you have. On a larger well, meaning producing a lot more, you have the economics that justify all of this equipment. It also means you generally have a pipeline to take that gas away. If you don't have a pipeline to take that gas away, then there's nothing you can do with it except to burn it. But, even if you burn it, if you do it effectively, that's 99% efficient. Now, you could argue that 1%, we need to get rid of that too, but 99% should be able to be burned. But the problem becomes when you have smaller wells that are marginal, they can't justify all this equipment. They can't justify $20,000 of equipment if you're only producing 2 or 3 barrels a day. And so it makes it very hard to do the corrective measures that. Go ahead.
Okay, but now episode, I think it was 157. We had Sharon Wilson from Oil. I'm trying to remember the name of her charity, her NGO, and she goes around with a thermal imaging camera and films huge plumes of stuff happening in thermal frequencies. So you can't see the naked eye. You'd look at this, vent stack, a flare stack. There's nothing to see. But when you look at it with a thermal imaging camera, you see that actually there's all sorts of stuff coming out, great big clouds of it. And that wouldn't trigger a fine. That won't get noticed by anybody. It's only because Sharon goes around and, and films it that anybody knows that some of these things are happening. So isn't the problem just much bigger than you're characterizing it right now?
Well, first, if I'm Sharon, I'm going to be showing the big ones because that gets attention. There's a whole lot of other wells that aren't showing any type of gas. So it's not every well out there with these huge plumes, as you'd like to say. But a lot of these companies we deal with have their own monitoring systems or own teams that go around and use cameras like what Sharon uses or various forms of those to monitor themselves. They also pay for flyovers and drones to fly over that have the cameras that can see those type of methane type of leaks. You also have the various satellites that are now out there that have very poor resolution, but at least it can start identifying areas that might be. So a lot of companies and a lot of regulatory groups are doing what Sharon does with that camera, but just on a more massive level. But again, just be careful that there are definitely problems out there and there's definitely bad actors out there, but there's a lot of companies that are performing very, very well, but that doesn't make the news. So you're not going to seeing video of a flare that's performing perfectly is not that exciting. So you won't see those.
Okay, but the thesis that there's all this kind of stuff that's invisible to the naked eye, but that is happening kind of everywhere, that you don't recognize that picture. You don't think that's a correct characterization?
Well, there's definitely problems out there. There's definitely bad actors out there, but but if you look at the numbers, there have been significant improvement. If you look, for example, from 2019 to 2022, we increased gas production by close to 11%. At the same time, the methane that's produced on a per day basis decreased 37%. So, is that perfect? Is that zero? No. But is that a significant improvement? Yes, especially when you consider that you have that number of wells you've mentioned. That's a huge logistical and capital issue to be able to reduce and manage all of those wells in all of those places.
Okay, now we're we're jumping a little bit between oil and gas, but that's good because I want to segue onto gas more because I think we've got a good handle now in this conversation on why stuff's coming out. It's being released from dissolved gases within oil. It's at high pressure. It can't be contained, et cetera, and that's resulting in some of these releases, or and so on. Okay, we kind of get that. But let's come to gas, because gas is really, we started this talking about methane, and there is this kind of break-even leak rate where if it's more than a certain level, and it's 3. I think it's 3.8%. It's 3.2 or 3.8. I can't recall exactly. I think it's I had it in the intro. And at that point, because methane is such a ferocious greenhouse gas, you might as well just not use methane, not use natural gas. You might as well just burn coal. And so the number that you've got end to end that you can leak, that you can afford to leak, is very, very low. If we're really going to address climate change, you have to be not just as good as coal, 3.2 or 3.8%, whatever the number is. You've got to be down at the kind of 0.1, 0.2, or, zero would be good, but we think that's probably going to be impossible. But it really has to be very low,
Sure.
tenths of a percent.
Well, your goal is to get it down to zero. That should be your goal. That should be my goal. That's everyone's goal, is to get it as low as possible, and zero is the preferred.
Right, but let's start with let's talk about Bob Howarth, professor at Cornell, who published really influential papers saying let's take all the data that is out there that we can. Not the self-reported stuff that says, well, I didn't see it, so it's not happening, but actually where people have measured. And the figure that he came up with, and this was 2011, he came up with a figure of 3.2% median. So some better, yes, some worse, some super emitters. But that was only for upstream and midstream. And then you've got another couple of percent downstream, because, they were also driving around in Boston and sniffing and saying, oh, the air seems to be full of, there's methane emitted also downstream. In other words, in the distribution to the homes and offices and so on, and commercial properties. So, if it's 3.2% upstream and midstream, then you can kind of kiss goodbye to being even better than coal, let alone addressing climate change. So are these numbers now just wrong, or are we kind of like, yes, that was the problem, but we're dealing with it? Or how do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, let's clarify. What year was that done in?
Well, that was 2011. However, there have been other reports since, lots of studies. The most recent one, which is recent, median emissions upstream and midstream range from 0.2% to 40%, medium 3.7%. So that kind of 3 to 4% mid and upstream seems fairly robust even now.
Yeah.
And we'll put links into the notes to the research so people can kind of poke around.
And this next comment I'm going to make, I'm not trying to be a homer for the oil industry, but because data is with ESG dynamics, that's what we focus on. And being gearhead engineers, we love data. And the problem you have is that for every academic study that is out there, there is actual field-based data that says something different. EPA has numbers out there that are significantly lower than that, closer to 1%. Studies that we've done with the EPA data shows that looking at the methane tax and kind of how everyone goes, shows that the operators are at below 0.2% as far as the methane. So data is very important, and right. It's great that he has that data. I would say he's probably not accurate, and I'd say some of the numbers I said are not accurate. I think if we're really going to be serious about this, we need to actually get better data to be able to judge, because otherwise we're speculating on the low end or speculating on the high end, and it sends us on a wrong path.
Right. And just to be, I was sort of trying to come in early because the IEA, the International Energy Agency, does actually come up with a figure that's about twice the EPA figure. So you've kind of got Bob Howarth, 3 to 4, and lots of academics, 3 to 4%. You've got the EPA kind of around 1%. Then you've got the IEA kind of around 2%. But that's just midstream and upstream. So this is a huge problem. We also know, by the way, that there are some very good players that are at the 0.1, 0.2%. Obviously, I'm familiar with a lot of the players in the North Sea basin, the offshore in the North Sea, where the numbers do seem to be 0.1, 0.2%. And some of the companies in Texas, Oklahoma are, I don't want to say are claiming that, because that makes it sound like I don't believe them, but I leave it up to the audience to know whether they should believe them.
But also think through, when you're talking the North Sea, you're talking a fewer number of wells, more expensive wells that can handle all of the extra equipment, and relatively newer wells. Now, I know they've been there 20 plus years, but you've got wells out in West Texas that have been out there for 60, 70 years when the technology wasn't there, the economics aren't there. So so the North Sea better be better because of the size, the newness. So I appreciate that.
Right. But there is another difference also, which is, of course, that you are fracking, right? And fracking, has also come in for a lot of flack about seismicity and so on, but also about leakage rates. Is any of that, in your view, justified?
Most of the wells, you're right, are fracked, but that just is a way to increase production. So that's your two different things. One is increasing the production through fracking, but you still have to worry about the emissions and the venting on the top. Whether you frack or not, you've got to worry about that. So the fracking is
the fracking is not creating a leakage pathway from
If
subsurface.
you put a piece of pipe down the hole and then you frack through it, if that pipe is cemented correctly, you don't have leakage coming through. You have it controlled through the pipe, and then it can be controlled. So now the fracking doesn't have anything to do with emissions. And as soon as I say this, you'll come up with some little example, but that is not the main issue.
No. The reason I'm pushing it is just I think it's really important, for the audience to kind of, this is what I'm trying to do, is slice and dice the problem down to, is it orphan wells? Is it the small players? Is it the big players? Is it fracking? And we can close off some avenues. Yep. We can have better discussions, right? And there was something else you said, which is so important, which is we need real data. Because the other person in that episode 157, Sebastian Birod, is a proper, academic trying to actually reconcile, we got methane building up in the atmosphere, the concentration's increasing. Where is it coming from? And then reconciling it back down to whether it's agriculture, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's this, whether it's that. But, does this kind of...
Just a quick point, though, on that data, that a lot of the academics, it's all about probabilities and statistics. So they're taking certain data points and extrapolating that, which is academically probably very correct, but it can be very misleading because it depends on what area. Not all basins are the same. So if you do a study in the Marcellus, or which is more dry gas, or if you do it in the Delaware Basin of the Permian, which is more oily, you can get drastically different numbers. So the key, like any study, is to really understand where that data came from and how they're extrapolating it to get to that. Now, at the same time, the actual data that they're self-reporting, there's definitely people that are playing games with that. But you already, within the EPA and these state agencies, have a proper way to accumulate that data. I think the key is to making sure that that's good data, either through enforcement, through modernizing their data system. Again, I go back to how those two agencies can't communicate because they haven't even identified the well the same way. There are basic things you can do to make that usable data.
But this feels like the way forward. It feels like if we were going to have this conversation again in 10 years, 44 years after we sat together at HBS in Kresge Hall, or in the classrooms there, we would be surely in a completely different place, because aren't we going to end up with sensors everywhere? Because sensors become really cheap. Drones become really cheap. Satellites, there's already, Methane Sat and a whole bunch of other satellites up there. And then the ability to aggregate that data and to find the patterns with machine learning surely is being completely transformed. So doesn't it just feels like this feels really primitive, if I'm honest, and I don't mean that I'm not trying to be funny, but what we're doing now just feels really primitive compared to, I think, what we'll be doing in 10 years.
I hope you're right, but for example, when the EPA gathers all the greenhouse gas data, that is due by the end of the year, or for 2023, that was due March 31. You don't see that data till October. So you don't see the data till 10 months later. And you know that if you don't get data soon, it's really not worth a lot because so much has happened since then. And so how do you
And if you can't analyze
exactly,
it, if
and
you
how
don't
do you
have the
speed
ability
that
to
up?
actually analyze it,
You got to be able to
yeah.
speed that up.
So
And then back to your point about, yes, there are sensors, there's continuous monitoring, there's flyovers. The problem with all that data is how do you bring it together into a usable form in such a timely fashion that it can be used? For example, on the super emitter, if you identify a really bad actor and it's super emitter, you turn that over to the EPA, who then turns it over to the state, who then has to go and talk to you. That's going by everyone's recollection. They think that that's going to take 2 to 3 months. So you have a bad actor emitting. It's going to be 2 to 3 months before someone goes and says, "Hey, do something about this." Well, that's is that data worth anything at that point? I'm not saying don't use the data, but you've got to use it better because otherwise it's
right.
not worth anything.
So I have a very modest investment in a company called World Sensing, and what they're doing is using it's geotechnical sensing, so safety of tailings dams or railway cuttings or construction sites, and they're using a bunch of sensors. The sensors have existed for decades, but they're using a LoRa wireless collection and data logging approaches. And if you've got something like the Brumadinho Dam, the sensors actually were saying there's a problem, there's water, there's the water pressure, hydrostatic pressures are changing, but that data never made it to somebody who could make a decision to say, we've got a problem. Whereas once you start using these kind of mesh data collection, and then you can put machine learning on top of it, and you could react in real time. And you could say there's a pressure drop here, or you can do acoustic monitoring, or you can do whatever. The companies ought to be able to really, really up their game.
Which again
And the
sounds great in
regulators,
theory, but what happens is that what you're talking about with the dam, that's one huge project that can justify that because of the socioeconomic issues. How do you justify that? Even if we've been doing some searches on different sensors, and you're talking 6 to 7,000 upfront cost, and then 100 a month to maintain. Well, there are wells out there that can't justify that from an economic side. And
right.
So if you say, well, sorry, you got to put it on there, those people are going to just shut the well in, and you lose that production, and then it ultimately has a chance to become an orphan well.
So the half of my audience that were thinking that any releases of any sort were not decent emissions but indecent, they'll be going, what I'm hearing is this stuff is fundamentally not economic, because if it can't be done properly, if it can't be monitored, if it can't be done without these emissions, if you can't meet your regulatory requirements, and by the way, given that we have to be off fossil, we have to stop burning fossil fuels anyway, what the hell's going on here? Of course, this stuff should be shut in. Of course, those small wells should be shut down. Of course, those operators should be compensated or whatever. But that's what a transition looks like, surely.
The problem, though, becomes those unintended consequences that I mentioned, that someone's going to have to plug those wells. And then the economic of that area, little towns like Orla, Texas, that are dependent on those little producing wells, and the economy around that, the little machine shop, the little engine repair, all that goes away when you start shutting all that stuff in. And so, yes, it's great to have this transition and you compensate, but it is a much larger issue when you start working with a big butcher knife than you do with a scalpel.
Right. I mean, I suppose, but that is the challenge of, they call it a just transition. How do you make sure those communities have a route to do something else, et cetera? Because, the coal industry is facing this, right? Your automotive, the internal combustion engine car industry is facing this. In the past, other industries have faced it. It's not an excuse to keep doing bad things just because the transition will be too painful. But there are some programs in place, federal and state. Let's talk about those. And then I want to come back to, the sort of the international picture at the end to kind of sum up. So what programs? The Biden administration has put some programs in place. Texas has got some of its own programs. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, one of the largest ones is the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act, where there was money provided for marginal wells to be able to plug those. Texas ended up getting about $130 million to go and plug those type of wells. They have 5 years to do it, and they've got to decide which wells, because 130 million based on your numbers won't go that far. So who are the winners and losers? Is it a certain area that's near a big city or population center? How do you figure that out? But so there's some money for that. There's also additional money through the Inflation Reduction Act for low capitalized producers. And that money, and that's more significant, that potentially could be several $100 million that go to Texas. And overall, I think it's like closer to $1 billion for the U.S. And that's to go help these small producers identify what their issues are and help them fix. But then it becomes an issue of good money after bad. If it's not an economic well or a marginal well, how much money do you spend on it? Are you better off just saying plug it or let it be and focus on where the real leaks and the emission events are? So it creates its own issues there.
But just to triangulate, where I come up with a kind of, a million wells and the number of we're sort of talking about ultimately it's going to be a $100 billion plus problem over some period.
Probably.
Potentially that was just based on a million, but it may be 2 or 3 times order of magnitude. It's hundreds of billions of dollar problem ultimately to deal with all these little wells and locations. So it's kind of a very small drop in the ocean. Maybe you can call it a sort of first pilot project, surely.
And what's missing on all of this, kind of back to the whole data, is the analysis of the issue and the wells, but then what can you do to improve it? Like there's all these continuous monitoring systems, there's all these cameras, but there's no studies to say which ones are really effective and which ones are not. So if you have a shiniest tool, then you can maybe sell it, but that might not be the best one. And there's no studies from academia or industry or government to really help narrow in and have best practices for some of these emissions items. So there's probably better ways of using some of that money initially to be able to really identify the best practices, the best solutions, and then you can go and apply.
I was very struck in Norway. There was a study a bunch of years ago, I think it was around 2016, where they said, what are all the places, where is gas, leaking from? And they just went through absolutely end to end, and they found 41 different, this valve, that valve, when you do this, when you clear a tank, when you do maintenance, when you whatever. And then they kind of quantified them, and then they started to do programs around them. And it was just incredibly sort of analytically driven. So it gave, it felt very satisfying for me to read about it. But what you're saying is there isn't that. There's just sort of bits of money being thrown at different bits of the problem, but without that sort of overview.
Well, and like for the EPA, they have a thing called Subpart W, which identifies and has factors for each leak. But it's all very academic. And what that does is makes it so that certain actuators or certain valves or pumps, they have numbers that they say, this is how much emissions they'll have on that. And we've worked with companies that have done actual studies on their equipment, and it's significantly different. And I was there and saw this. They're not lying about it. It just, when you start taking general numbers and doing a sweep through, you're going to misrepresent a lot of things. And that has consequences when all of a sudden your methane tax is a lot higher than you think it is, things like that.
And let's talk about the methane tax, because there was some pots of money to plug things and for the undercapitalized providers and so on. But the methane tax is something potentially much bigger, right?
It is. It's and what's interesting is that as an industry, methane tax is anything over 0.2% of methane.
So tell us start with where did it come from? What is the methane tax? Assume that we don't know anything. That would be broadly true in my case. So start with where did it come from? When did it come into force? How big is it?
And it's formally known as the waste emission charge. And basically, it's a way to tax or fine companies that have excessive methane associated with it. It was passed about a year ago, and it started the implementation started as of January 1st of this year. However, there's still a lot of rules and regulations that are still trying to be formalized on that, of like even to when do you turn in your data. It's all going to be based on the same greenhouse gas calculations and data that you're filing already. And then they're just going to use that data to also determine the tax. And what it is it's based on the metric ton of your CO2 equivalent. It's going to be over 900 the first year, this year, 1,200, 1,500. So it escalates up. And
that is per ton of CO2 equivalent on a 100-year basis?
No, just from a production basis, based on, and a lot of it has to do with factors. That if you have a certain number of pumps and actuators, they have it's a very formulaic calculation to see how much you have there. Again, back to what we were saying earlier, it's then divided by your production. And so if you have a lot of production, then your percent goes way down. If you don't, say you're a small operator or a mid-size operator, you have a lot of wells, so your numerator is big because you have a lot of equipment and not a lot of production. And so it's really going to be honorary to the small producer.
Tell me, just to help us to triangulate here, natural gas in the US, Henry Hub is the index that's used, and it's priced per million BTU, British thermal units again.
Thank you.
And the Henry Hub price is about $2, something like $2. How much might that go up for a good operator or a bad operator? What's the sort of range? I mean, we're talking about the methane tax might make that, $2 and a cent, or might it make it $3 or $4?
No.
How big is this? Just give us an order of magnitude.
You're talking two different things. Methane tax is a fine that if you're generating too much methane or CO2 equivalent,
agreed,
that will be a fine. Now, what you're alluding to is certification of the gas. So that if you certify it through several different agencies like MIQ or OGMP 2.0, which is a UN-based
acronyms.
I know acronyms,
Grant,
but these are certification groups that, and there was this flurry of folks that were trying to certify their gas because they believed they would get a bump of 2 cents an MCF or something like that. Well, it turns out most of them have not.
Right. No,
but what is going to most likely happen from a certification, bringing it to the international side, is that to take your gas and convert it to LNG to then ship over to Europe, you're most likely going to have to be certified because now you're competing with the North Sea and their cleaner gas. Right. So there are places where the certification will matter. Again, methane tax, so has nothing to do with that.
But let's go back to let me ask the question, rephrase. I got off on Henry Hub and all sorts of stuff, but
you did all that just so you could say British thermal unit again.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. I just had to we had to get back to the kind of like making fun of the whole Texan thing a little bit and a bit of banter because it's probably getting a bit dull, too many emissions, whatever. But let's go back to, I guess what I'm asking really is by how much could the methane tax, what percent, you could do it in percent if you don't like, dollars per million BTU. Are we talking about the methane tax might drive up the cost of gas in the US by 5%, 1%, or 50%? What's the kind of order of magnitude impact that we're going to be talking about?
Well, you're a lot smarter. You're
a
lot smarter than me, so you can talk about the macroeconomics. What we're seeing is that it could affect upwards to $1 billion of additional taxation or fines. Then with this additional, that's in a year. And then with these additional factors, increases in factors that I was talking about, that could increase at another 40, 50%. So you could be talking 1.5 to 2 billion a year of additional tax cost associated with it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the operator is going to be able to pass that on because of the global market that it is. That price could still be $2 or $3, and they're just incurring additional cost through that taxation. Yeah. So it doesn't. Okay. There's not a direct relationship between the cost and the price, like a commodity.
But it's interesting because thank you for that, because $1 billion spread over all of the revenue of the entire gas sector in the US it's small percentage. So it's not 5%, 10%. It's small.
As a general limit, real quick, Michael, that's true generally, but this is geared because of that numerator denominator thing. It's going to affect the smaller operators much more harder than it will a Chevron or one of those. So it's a very disproportionate taxation that will really hurt the small producer and not really affect the large producer.
But, on the other, you could also say that it creates another pool of 1 billion, or maybe it's going to double or triple, so, 1 to 3 billion, which is sort of the prize if you fix this problem. So it's another pool of pressure, pool of money to actually fix the problem. So, I guess, but what you're saying is that it's regressive because it hits the smaller operators. And that's something fascinating that I think that's a takeaway here. That actually, as we really push down on the methane leakages and methane emissions, in a way, it's very much to the advantage of the big guys because they can suck up the costs, and they've got the big wells that are probably going to be easier to put fixed sensors to, et cetera, et cetera. But it could drive a real change in the structure of the industry.
Yeah, 2 points there. One is that these larger companies have the capabilities, and it does help drive the consolidation. And we've been seeing that lately. Now, it's not just because of the environmental that all this consolidation has happened recently in the Permian and in Texas, but there is some factor to that. But the other point, and I alluded to it earlier, is that the unintended consequence that these small producing wells are the backbone of many communities throughout. And it's going to kill those from an economic standpoint. And so that $1 billion you raise, you better train them to do something, but I don't know what you're going to be able to train all of these disparate communities throughout West Texas and other places to do to replace their income.
But I mean, you can understand how this makes a lot of people sort of angry that those people are basically holding hostage, not just, Texas, not just the US, but the world, because, I hear you on the community needs a way forwards. But if the companies are simply saying, look, I'm just going to walk away. I just put this thing into bankruptcy because you've made it impossible to operate, and it's not my problem. And somebody else has to now pay, 20,000, 50,000, 100,000, 2 million to plug it. And that's just not my problem. And you can see that's a pretty unpopular position in not just
sure.
Around the world, but also locally.
And I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, but that type of mentality happens not just in the oil industry, but we see it in a variety of industries and a variety of businesses around the world. But you better be prepared for those unintended consequences, because they will happen. Mark my words.
But isn't the answer kind of what happened with the German coal plants, and it's going to happen with gas distribution networks in the UK and other places? In the end, there's going to be a big negotiation, and there's going to be a kind of super fund type, resolution, just a lot of money from, federal, some state, and the problem it's going to get fixed over a 50-year time period or something like that. Isn't that ultimately where this ends up?
Probably so. The problem is the ones negotiating from the industry standpoint are the Exxons and the BPs and the much larger companies that have the lobbying capabilities. And so you can definitely see how the rules and how this will be skewed toward the larger producers, because little oil company in Orla, Texas is not represented in Washington, D.C.
Right.
At all. And so there's talk about have and have nots. It's playing out that way in spades right now.
And that's very reminiscent, by the way, of discussions about in the farming industry in the UK and elsewhere, because the small farmers are just not round the table with the politicians in the same way as the big, the Bungys and the Cargills and the big industrial farmers. They've got the ear of the politicians, and the small farmers tend not to. Just let's come to the international piece.
Real quick on that, though, Michael, is the other part of that is these regulators, these politicians that are all making this, they don't know what the oil. If you ask them where emissions comes from, and a lot of your audience members, I would be hazardous yourself.
Well, that's very simple. Texas.
Exactly. But they don't know how it really works. And they're making rules and taxes and all to say that. We had a significant player from the EPA into Midland, and that was her first time. And she's in charge of implementing all of the regulation we just mentioned. That was her first time to ever be on an oil location. It's very hard to regulate and to manage something that you don't even know how it works. And she went to a big, shiny new location, and is thinking that that's how it all works. And it's like, no, there's a whole lot of other uglier situations out there, economically or environmentally, that you have to consider. And so it makes it very scary that those people are making rules and regulations when they don't even know how it works.
So the energy transition is littered with unintended consequences because of regulations put in place by people who, don't move outside, whether it's the Beltway in DC or whether it's out of Westminster in the UK or whether it's out of Brussels. And this has happened time and time again. And it's what you're speaking my language, because we need more engineers in, STEM literate scientists, engineers, practitioners of all sorts, actually helping to drive this, not being consulted last. And that's true across the board. Let me just come back to that international piece, because there's a long history. You had George W. Bush launched something called methane to markets. Then, there was lots of activity, but, the numbers just keep getting worse and worse. Glasgow, COP26, there was the methane pledge, reducing methane emissions across the economy, not just from oil and gas, by 30% by 2030, which I immediately denounced as woefully unambitious. Now I'm not so sure after this conversation. And then there's been, as you say, in the EU, they're making noises about simply saying, you've got to meet some very stringent requirement to sell LNG to us, or we won't buy it. And it all sounds very high and mighty and wonderful until, of course, they are not able to buy Russian LNG or Russian gas and become very dependent. How does that play in Texas or in Oklahoma, New Mexico? I mean, are people actually reading the, International Herald Tribune and following the news out of Europe and out of Brussels? And does all this does this register or not?
Oh, I don't know. The larger companies clearly understand the macroeconomic and the international consequences, but our congressman from Midland, August Pfluger, is bringing up the point of it being a homeland security, an international security type of an issue, talking about oil and gas production. And you see that with Ukraine, you see that with the European area and where they get their gas from Russia and all. So if you don't have good oil and gas sources, you really put yourself in a bind. So it makes it even more complicated on how, yes, Biden wants to shut down LNG, and others, Sharon wants to shut down LNG, but then Russia, you need to protect against Russia. Well, you can't do everything. You got to pick a poison there, because a lot of times it's one will definitely affect the other.
Yeah, it's a huge. I was just thinking about when you say you got to pick a poison. That may be exactly the best analogy possible. That we're going to be poisoned. We can be poisoned by climate change. We can be poisoned by geopolitical conflict or whatever. So maybe I would like to think that we can somehow kind of thread the needle and actually walk and chew gum at the same time.
So many issues that affect the United States, whether it's immigration, abortion, whatever, it's not a simple, you do one thing and you solve it. And that's clearly here in the environmental area, because you've got to first take care of the root cause of the leak, but then you also have to make sure that the global warming, of however that's defined and done, how that can get resolved. And it's a very complex, and getting, one thing that the U.S. government has unfortunately proven is that it's not capable of dealing with very complex issues. And especially as we head into a presidential election, and we seem to always be in an election period, that to go and say you're going to shut down wells, or you're going to tax wells, or you're not going to allow LNG, there's effects on that, and it's you're going to lose some votes. And how strong do you want to be towards your issue?
But what's striking there is this kind of polarization, and what gets sort of put in the front row is we're going to stop, we're going to ban this, stop this, and then of course the other side has to say, well, we're going to encourage that and we're going to start that and fund that, right? But it feels to me like the first thing to do is to say, stuff that surely people could agree on. Like, for instance, in 10 years' time, wouldn't it be fantastic if the US, everybody could agree had got to the point where there was only 0.1, 0.2% leakage. Wouldn't that just be great? Isn't that, don't you first have to say, almost bipartisan, can't everybody agree that that's a good target?
Well, you even have to go a step.
Would you agree?
Have to, definitely, but you almost have to go a step before that and say you will need oil and gas in 10 years. Because there's people that don't think you need oil and gas in 10 years and you can eliminate all of that. That's not going to happen. But if you have, so you first have to start with that. And so you're going to have some oil and gas. Yes, you can do wind and solar and a variety of other things, but you're going to have some oil and gas. Then you say, well, what is an acceptable emissions level? Obviously closer to zero than not. And then how do you get there? And the problem with how do you get there also is that if you really want to do big steps in in worrying about emissions, you worry about midstream pipeline so that you can get that gas out of there in a safe and environmentally. But there's a lot of people that don't want to provide permits or do anything with that. Then the other thing you need to do is improve the electrical grid system so that you can get rid of compressors that use diesel-fired engines and use electrical. Well, that's a huge capital requirement, and you're also got to get permits to get all the transmission lines. Well, if you do those two things, you will have a huge effect on emissions because of how you can replace things. But what's the likelihood, the folks that want to get rid of emissions approving that? I have not seen it.
But to your point about there'll be oil and gas in 10 years, absolutely. But, we could also go further out and say, okay, 2050, there may be oil and gas, but they're not allowed to be any net emissions, right? That's what that's what climate science says. And so then you say, okay, so do we agree with that? I had a very interesting interaction with Lorenzo Simonelli, I think it is the CEO of Baker Hughes in Dubai, because he was on a panel I was chairing, and we talked about net zero, and they were very committed to net zero 2050. That's the corporate strategy. And I said, okay, but you're a service company. Does that mean that by 2050, you will not work with oil and gas companies that have not abated, that are still doing, selling their product, and that product is causing emissions? And at that point, he wouldn't answer the question.
Sure.
So I'm like,
well, and that's true for everyone. Everyone wants it to be completely green. Everyone wants it to be an electric vehicle. Everyone wants this until the consequence or the commitment in spending all the money for the grid or for the electric filling or losing customers. There's consequences to all that. And you find out who will back up. And that works not only for the oil types and the corporate types, but also the environmental advocacy types. Because if you get rid of oil and gas right now, then there goes your synthetics, there goes your plastics. Are you really ready for that? So it's, again, just like in American politics, there's such a far left and far right. There's such a pro-oil, anti-oil. And it's like, come on, guys, get in the middle and get some solutions done.
So that was my attempt to kind of, achieve some grand bargain, which didn't work very well. But I think I think the kind of getting down to whatever you're doing, have 0.1, 0.2% leakage surely is a vision that I think everybody, and do it quickly, 5, 7, 10 years, not mess around, figure out how, because it's got these distributive consequences, figure out how to manage those rather than be scared off by them, and maybe we're getting somewhere.
It's great to have satellites. It's great to have all that. And at the end of the day, you're trying to eliminate emissions and leaks. And that comes from a well or a pipeline. And you've got to figure out the technology and the culture and the dedication to fix it at that level.
Right. And you've got to get the boots on the ground. Grant, it's been an enormous pleasure.
Thank you, Michael.
And I certainly feel like I've learned a whole hell of a lot in the last hour. So I thank you.
The only thing I regret is that we didn't have a drinking game today with on the number of times you said methane, which I say is methane. But if we did do that, I would be completely drunk by now. So it's probably best that we did not do that.
Methane, methane, methane. Look after yourself.
Very good. Thank you, Michael. Appreciate you.
So that was Grant Swartzwelder, president of OTA Environmental Solutions, founder and co-manager of ESG Dynamics. I don't know if I'm more or less optimistic about methane emissions at the end of our conversation, but I certainly feel a lot more knowledgeable. And I do think we'll be in a different place in terms of data and our ability to wade through it to take action, should we so choose. As always, we'll put a link in the show notes to some useful resources. That's the company websites for OTA Environmental Solutions and ESG Dynamics, the papers by Professor Rob Howarth that we mentioned in the episode, and a link to episode 157 of Cleaning Up with Sharon Wilson and Dr. Sebastian Bierode, the methane hunters. Please make sure that you subscribe to Cleaning Up on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. And if you've enjoyed this episode, make sure you give it a like or a thumbs up and leave a comment. That really helps other people find it. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Instagram, and also subscribe to our free newsletter on cleaninguppod.substack.com. That's cleaninguppod.substack.com. Cleaning Up is brought to you by the Liebreich Foundation, the Gilardini Foundation, and Ecopragma Capital. Please join us next week for another episode of Cleaning Up.